Hello, friends. Today we are in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Can you hear the rain that's gently coming down outside my window? Can you hear that on this video? Boy, that's such a sweet sound. I wish you were here. As I said, we're in the first 5 verses of chapter 3 of 1 Thessalonians today, and here in this section, in this paragraph, Paul is writing about Timothy's mission to Thessalonica. You may remember that Paul had to leave Thessalonica quickly, and he left alone. He went to Berea, and then he went to Athens, and Silas and Timothy later rejoined him in Athens. But from Athens, Paul decides Timothy needs to go back to Thessalonica and check on these new Christians and see how they're doing. And so these first 5 verses of chapter 3 tell us about Timothy's mission as he returns back to Thessalonica. You know, it's strange the things you remember. I forget names easily, but there are some memories I have that are 35, 40 years old. Are you this way too? I remember a time when I was trying to preach an expository series through 1 Thessalonians. And this was when we lived in Oklahoma City, and I was preaching for the Wilshire congregation. It's funny how I read this verse and I think about that time. Let me tell you about it. I was preaching a sermon in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, and I was trying to make the point that Paul did 3 things for the Thessalonian Christians. You know, every sermon needs to have 3 points, right? Paul did 3 things for the Thessalonian Christians. Number 1, he wrote them a letter. Number 2, he sent them a helper. And number 3, he prayed for them. And after I preached that sermon, Raymond Kelsey came up to me. Raymond was the longtime preacher of that congregation and the chair of the Bible department at Oklahoma Christian. He came up to me and he said, "Kerry, that's the first time I've ever heard that organization of this chapter in a sermon." And he said, "I think it's the first time I've ever heard mentioned in a sermon that Paul sent a helper to Thessalonica and how that we need to send helpers to one another to encourage faith." I don't know why I remember that. Of course, it was a great encouragement to me for Raymond Kelsey, who was always a great encourager anyway, for him to say that to me. Well, I didn't have the heart to tell him that the idea was not original with me. I'm sure I read it out of a Warren Wiersbe paperback. It was a collection of expository sermons on 1 Thessalonians, and the title of it was Be Ready. And you see my library behind me? Here's the book right here that I probably read from and stole that sermon from. Anyway, Paul cared enough for these Thessalonians that he sent them a helper. Now, in the first verse of this chapter, he says, "We could bear it no longer." He's talking about Silas and Timothy and how the 3 of them could not bear it any longer, that they had not seen these Thessalonians recently. But in verse 5, he says, "I could bear it no longer." When I could bear it no longer, I decided to do something about it. The suspense was unbearable for Paul. He desperately wanted to know how these Thessalonian Christians were doing. Were they still loyal to Jesus? Were they faithful to the call that they had received? What was the state of their faith? And I love this verse. In verse 5, I love this phrase. Paul says, "When I could bear it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith." I sent to find out about your faith. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? I had to know how you were doing. But what is Paul concerned about? He's concerned about their spiritual well-being. He's concerned about their faith. And I'm reading this passage and I'm thinking to myself, Kerry, are there people in your life who frequently inquire about your faith? Not really. Come to think of it, Kerry, are there people in your life for whom you inquire about their faith? Not really. Oh, we care about each other physically. "How are you doing?" we say to each other. And we usually mean by that, well, how are you doing? Tell us, are you in good physical shape? We pray for each other's physical health. We inquire about each other's physical health. But do we pray for each other's spiritual health? And do we inquire about that? How much do we care about the state of our faith? Well, I think about my own spiritual welfare, but how often do I think about the spiritual welfare of others? You know something, folks? I feel like preaching a sermon right now. We all probably, maybe this is true of you, it's true of me, we all need to take more seriously our spiritual health. And Paul is encouraging us here. Paul is encouraging me in this verse to take seriously the spiritual health, the state of the faith of others. Oh, this is such an inspiring verse. It's a convicting verse. God, motivate us to take the spiritual welfare of others more seriously. Are you with me? Thank you for your time.